I'm Andy Yan, and I'm the director of the City program here at Simon Fraser University. I'd like to begin with the acknowledgement that this event is happening on the Coast Salish people's territories, whom we are privileged to live, work, and play. I'd like to welcome you to tonight's presentation of the 2019 Warren Gill lecturer, Mary Rowe, and her presentation of Canada's Enduring Two Solitudes, Can We Bridge the Urban-Rural Divide? This event was made possible with the sponsorship from the SFU Community Trust and the SFU Harbor Center campus. It is part of the 30th anniversary of the SFU campus, through which Warren Gill, the namesake of this series, played a pivotal role in the campus's establishment in downtown Vancouver. I would like to invite Andrew Petter, the President and Vice Chancellor at SFU, to the stage to provide the formal welcome and remarks on the legacy of Warren Gill. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Andy, and welcome all to SFU Vancouver. It is a wonderful evening, and I'm just delighted to be able to be here. I regret that I'm not going to be able to stay for the lecture for reasons of other commitments, but I wanted to be here because this is a very special time for us at SFU. This is the 30th anniversary of our Vancouver campus. You may have noticed some of the signs outside that very subtly remind you of that fact. But because it is the 30th anniversary, it's a time not only to celebrate SFU Vancouver, but to celebrate Warren Gill, who truly was a visionary in working with others at SFU and leading SFU to decide to create a Vancouver campus. And this campus is more than just another site where we deliver programs. It has very much become defining for the entire university. I hope most of you are aware that we call ourselves and are now more widely known as Canada's engaged university, the most community engaged research university in the country. And that wouldn't be the case today if we hadn't have made the pivotal decision to come down from the mountain and establish a campus here in Vancouver. The Vancouver campus now comprises 9 facilities. It is by far the largest post-secondary presence in the city. It has been celebrated by the Vancouver Sun as the intellectual heart of the city. None of that would have happened if more than 30 years ago and over the course of the early development of the campus, Warren Gill hadn't used his expertise as a geographer and his vision as an educator to see the possibility of what bringing SFU to Vancouver could mean for the city. It most certainly has revitalized and enlivened a part of the city that would have, I think, been in a serious decline. It has tried to be a positive force with respect to the downtown east side. This facility in particular provides programming and support for the downtown east side. It's brought culture to the community, but it's also been of huge value to SFU. We are a university that benefits now because we are able to welcome you to lectures like this, because we are able to host dialogues in public square, which we learn from the community as much as the community learns from us. Our students are very much involved in community learning and community engagement, and even as they're contributing, they too are learning. And we as a campus, we as a university with campuses in Surrey now, where we're engaged in suburban transformation here, where we've been very much a force for urban revitalization, and even on Burnaby Mountain, where we are developing an integrated community called University that will grow in the next few years to 9,000. None of that would have happened if the pioneers who had that vision, and Warren Gill, very much a leader amongst them, hadn't have made the decision to come to SFU Vancouver and make this our downtown campus those 30 years ago. So for me, it was very important to be here this evening and to recognize Warren and that contribution, because this lecture series is very much a tribute to him and a reminder of the contribution that he made to us. The other legacy or other way in which we recognize Warren's legacy is through a Warren Gill Award for Community Impact. And that, of course, is no surprise because of the impact that this campus has had and Warren had through his work as a geographer and as a pioneer in developing this campus. It's an award that recognizes a faculty or staff member who's had a major positive impact on the social, economic, environmental, or cultural fabric of the communities that SFU serves. And this year's recipient, Bob Hackett, is an exemplar of that. And I know Warren, if he were still alive with us today, would be so proud of what has been accomplished at SFU Vancouver and of the contributions that our faculty continue to make to community betterment and are now gaining recognition through the Warren Gill Award. Now, I did also want to say a word or two about tonight's lecture. I think it is going to be a fascinating lecture, and I'll be sure to pick it up on media. But Enduring Canada's Two Solitudes, Can We Bridge the Urban-Rural Divide, is an especially timely topic for us. The rural-urban divide so often defines and separates us on issues throughout the country. It's an important divide and one that we should all pay attention to in the lead up to the fall's federal election. And I'd very much like to thank Mary Rowe for joining us this evening, and thank you for joining us this evening for what I know will be a fascinating and productive dialogue. And with that, I will now call upon Gordon Harris, who is the president and CEO of Simon Fraser University's Community Trust, to introduce Mary Rowe, our speaker. Gordon.
Thank you, Andrew. If I had been a little quicker. I'm really pleased to be here tonight and pleased to see so many of you here. This is a real honor for me to be involved again this year with the Warren Gill Lecture Series. And along with Warren Gill's wife, Shondell Runka, who's in the room, I'm one half of the organizing committee. And I was delighted to see, walking in tonight, Gord Price, who was, for the first several years, also part of that organizing committee. So I'm glad to see you're here tonight, Gord. I want to thank Andy Yan and his team at the SFU City program for all their help in getting this organized. Events like this look easy, they're not, and there were a lot of people involved, and certainly Pansy Huey in our office at SFU Community Trust, Andy Yan and his team, and Dr. Laurie Anderson and his staff in the SFU Vancouver office were incredibly helpful, so thank you. When Andy started, he noted two sponsors, Simon Fraser University, the downtown campus, and also SFU Community Trust. I'd like to take a minute just to acknowledge past sponsors of the Warren Gill Lecture Series. ACOM, Polygon Homes, McCarthy Tetro, Park Lane Homes, Terra Law, Bing Tom Architects, which is now Reverie Architecture, and of course SFU and the Trust. I'm pleased to see sitting in the audience tonight the former chair of the board of directors of SFU Community Trust, David Galanders, and sitting right in front of him is our current board chair, Barry McDonald, and a number of other board members, fellow board members are in the room tonight. So thank you all for being here. So this annual lecture series first started in 2011 with a guest lecturer, Witold Rybczynski. And since then, we've been fortunate to hear from other Canadian and international leaders in urban thinking, including Mark Kingwell, Jennifer Kiesmat, James Cheng, Michael Goldberg, and last year, Dr. David Halchansky from the University of Toronto. And we are privileged, as you've heard Andrew say this evening, to have Mary Rowe here to deliver this year's lecture. And this annual lecture is one way we have to honor Warren Gill, who dedicated his 33-year career to building Simon Fraser University's presence in this city and in this region. And you heard Andrew talk about that. Warren died far too young in September 2010. Warren was passionate about many things, but especially about urban life, and his commitment to the city and region was unequaled, unparalleled. Transit and transportation issues were of particular importance to Warren as an urban geographer. So he was an urban geographer, a university administrator, a musician, an eternal optimist, and a lover of trains, cruise ships, and martinis. And as Andrew Petter noted, the SFU Vancouver campus and this building owe so much to Warren's dedication to building SFU into a major downtown presence. He was also involved in the SFU expansion into Surrey City Centre, and he served for many years on the board of SFU Community Trust and played a very large role in the development of University on Burnaby Mountain. But mostly, for a lot of us in this room, and certainly for me, Warren was a good friend and someone we really miss. And so through this annual lecture series, his memory and his commitment to asking tough questions, raising issues, and invoking new ways of thinking about urban life lives on. So just before I introduce Mary Rowe, a little housekeeping. Please turn off the sounds on your phones if you haven't already done so. And I will check. I have. After Mary's lecture, Andy Ann is going to come back up. They're going to have a bit of a conversation and take questions from the floor, so be thinking about what you would like to probe further. So Mary Rowe, for 30 years, Mary Rowe has been a steady advocate and a champion for place-based approaches to building livable and resilient cities and community-driven local economies. A resourceful social entrepreneur, dynamic personality, and as you'll see tonight, a very convincing communicator. Mary's a sought-after project leader and recently was chosen as one of 300 for 300, an honor roll of individuals selected over 3 centuries for their unique contributions to the city of New Orleans, where she supported local community leaders to foster resilience after Hurricane Katrina. Mary has led national and international urban initiatives from Toronto and New York City, including Reimagining the Civic Commons, an initiative to strengthen elements of the urban fabric that create social cohesion and community resilience, including libraries, community centers, parks, and other third places. As Senior Advisor to Evergreen and Future Cities Canada and as co-executive lead for the National Urban Project, Mary's current roles include empowering Canadians' largest cities to be economically vibrant, socially inclusive, and environmentally sustainable. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mary Rowe.
Hi. I just had one of those moments, you know, when the president left and he had his papers with him, and I thought, what if he's taken my speech out the door too? Because I've left it right here. The other thing about that acknowledgement from New Orleans is that it was a total surprise to me, and I got a notice that I was one of the 300. And the best thing about it is that I'm in company with Marie Laveau, who is the 18th century voodoo priestess of New Orleans. I don't think it gets much better than that if you're in the company of a voodoo priestess. Anyway, thanks, Andy. Thanks to the president. And thanks to you, Gordon, for inviting me to do this. And I was very pleased to meet Chandel. And I just want to say a shout out here for the value of good public servants. You know, we have, I'm old enough to remember Newfie jokes, and they're gone. But then we have other ways that we slag folks, and we make comments about government that's disparaging. And I think, my gosh, you and I know, we all know public servants that are dedicated and extraordinarily expert at what they do, and they bring important expertise and experience and perspective. And so the fact that Warren had this long career here and that you're honoring him with an annual lecture is just a wonderful thing. So I want to, wherever she is, I don't know where you're seated, there you are. Hats off to your husband in his absence, and I hope that the fact that you're fostering this discourse in his memory is wonderful. So I'm very pleased to be here, and I've just got to say right off the bat, you know, lecture is just not a word that I use in a favorable way about myself. I hope that I never lecture. This is a chat. This is a talk. I'm going to throw out some ideas. I hope it's more of a discussion. And I'm happy to be here because, and to come to Vancouver again. I was here a few weeks ago, and I have sort of cycles when I come in and out. And because I know it'll be spring here. It's really spring nowhere else in the continent. Because I've kind of been there, and it ain't spring. It's spring here, so it's so nice. But the important thing, I think, for us coming into Vancouver is that we're always reminded, and I'm so admiring of it and of the Lower Mainland, because, you know, you can teach us a lot about place, which is what I'm going to talk about. You know, because of your inherited topography here, you always know where you are when you step out. And so I pulled this shot because I'm not tech savvy enough. I'm a woman of a certain age. I went out for a walk this morning thinking, oh, I'll just pull some slides from my phone and put them in my presentation, and that didn't work. So this is a shot I pulled off the internet. But interestingly, it's from an article in The Sun quoting Larry Beasley and Brent Tadarian saying that the city is actually not ready for the future. But doesn't it look pretty, you know? And I'm going to do something, and the next slide's going to advance. And then this is off your tourism page. You've just got to love it when your tourism authority organizes itself around whether it's Instagrammable. That these beauty shots. But what's interesting about this is that this quality of place that you probably all take for granted is sadly not true in every community. Because not everybody has an ocean and they don't have mountains. But even more sadly, our post-industrial development complex has generally delivered for us development. I'm going to show you a charming picture of it. And it's a lot of Ds I use for this form of development. So it's derivative, it's dull, it's drab. I can't even really bring myself to suggest that this is a place. But down lower right, that's apparently a place. And what's fabulous about this is that this is a promotional site for RioCan telling you that you should invest in that place, which is just hideous, you know. And interestingly, it's home to some of the most iconic brands, those kinds of places that are everywhere. And I know you have some. There's Tim Hortons. And for those of you that are too young to know, this is the Yellow Pages. When you go home tonight, ask your parents, oh, what were the Yellow Pages? But you have some of these places too. And the thing about it is that we have this extraordinary challenge about how we're investing in place and what kinds of places we're creating. So I took as my talk today this notion of enduring two solitudes and decided to lap in the urban-rural divide. And what do I do here? This is more of the Yellow Pages. As you can see, it gets more interesting. The thing I really like about this is if you see bottom right, it says, how to brew and steep the perfect coffee. That's bottom right of the Yellow Pages. Just so you know, in the Yellow Pages, you can learn how to brew a perfect coffee. But I chose this title, which I took in high school. I don't know how many of you read this book. It was a novel. You're all nodding, 1945, Hugh MacLennan. It was about the divide between French and English Canada. And I then looked up the Canadian Encyclopedia to see how they listed, and here's what they put. They were suggesting that the English and French Canada's challenge is our most troubling legacy. Now, you can kind of cut Hugh MacLennan a bit of slack because it was 1945, but I don't think the Canadian Encyclopedia entry dates back to 1945. So I don't want to trivialize this, but obviously we have many, many, many troubling legacies. This was only one that this book designer chose to highlight. Residential schools, internments, our chronic use of immigrant labor to build a railroad, how we continue to use immigrant labor to harvest crops in this country. The list goes on and on and on. And thankfully, in our national understanding of history and the land acknowledgement that you kindly offered, in which I heard this morning, in which I think you in the West do so much in such a profound and important way. Other parts of the country don't do it as well as you do it, to acknowledge our history and our legacy of exploitation of Indigenous peoples and how we're actually going to come to terms with not only the truth of that, but what the reconciliation looks like. And I think that place is one of the ways for us to start framing this discussion. When I was mentioning in Toronto, center of the universe, that I was coming here to give this talk, and I gave them the title, and the woman I was speaking to, I said, she said, well, which two solitudes are you going to speak to? English and French, settler and Indigenous, people of color and Caucasian, LGBTQ2 and straight. And then someone said to me, well, wait, what about the suburbs? There's really three solitudes. So it's really quite a list of dichotomies. And in the break, before we started, the president and I had this conversation. There are these dueling identities that we could really enumerate many, many. And then this morning, I was in a listening session that Shauna Sylvester put together on Future Cities Canada, and I heard East-West and how profound those Rocky Mountains are to getting that sense. So I don't think this is a question that is ideologically wedded one way or the other. I've chosen rural-urban, but I think it's a proxy for the way in which we're divided. And I pulled this just to remind ourselves that the right asks these questions as much as the left does. So this is an interesting article by Sean Speer. If you Google him, you'll find it. where he's talking about how we have to deal with the policy differences between rural and urban. And he's basically saying rural Canada is in trouble and they're not being properly paid attention to. If you went to some of the left sites, you'll see that they're saying, well, what's happened to the inner city? Why are we spending so much time on rural? So, I think that one of the ways that I'm going to, what I want to pose for us and what I hope we'll have a conversation about is, could we be thinking about place differently? And could we be finding that that might be our common element that could help us bridge this divide? Because we all care about place. So that's the question, does place actually matter? I want you to turn to your neighbor. And I want you to think of the last time you didn't sleep at home. Now, you don't have to, this isn't about TMI. When was the last time you spent a night sleeping in a community of fewer than 5,000 people? Talk to your neighbor, when was that the last time? And what do you remember about it? Okay, that's it. You don't have to get into the gory details. So, tell me this, how many of you have spent a night like that within the last 2 weeks? Okay. How many of you not within the last month? Longer than a month? How many longer than 6 months? How many can't actually remember? Right. So let's think about that. Let's think about the extent to which we're not actually in the company of others. And if we live urban, how often are we rural? And similarly, I bet if I asked that question of rural audiences, they would probably answer that they're in the city more frequently than you're in the country, but I don't want to guess that. But here's where I want us to think about, does place matter, and the extent to which our grounding and our sense of identity and meaning is derived from where we spend our time and perhaps where we've come from and what shaped us. So let's ask ourselves, does place matter? When I was last here, which I think Andy and I were doing the math 5 or 6 years ago, when I was last here to talk, I was here at the invitation of Bing Tom, and he, such a loss for you and such a loss for us, and I had met Bing actually overseas at a conference that was talking about the quality of communities. And Bing asked me to come and talk about New Orleans and my experience after Hurricane Katrina, the Marie Laveau reference. And I had come to speak about how the people of that place had come together. They basically self-organized to first reimagine and then over time rebuild their city, one house, one block, one neighborhood at a time. That's what I was looking at when I first got there. And I started then referring to New Orleans as a prophetic city, because this is shortly after. I know, you've got to love that. That's the resilience of people, damn it. And you can see there's still debris on the streets there, and that's probably in the spring of 06. The levees broke in 05, fall of 05. Anyway, I started to talk about how I felt that New Orleans was prophetic because it was really telling us about the future of cities and culture and the economy. And an academic at Rice University is publishing a book this fall called The Prophetic City, and it's about Houston and all of the demographic and economic changes and storm events that Houston's had to endure and what it can tell us. And, the New Orleans prophecy wasn't just about climate change, but of course it was. I mean, there was all sorts of stuff that went on. But my list of was there anybody who actually was at that talk I gave when Bing Tom invited me, other than you, Andy? Okay, good. Well, I'm just going to blow by it really quickly, which is basically that if you're not familiar with what actually happened in New Orleans, this was not a natural disaster. This was a failure of existing infrastructure. So it was about massive failures in hard infrastructure, chronic disinvestment in social soft infrastructure like schools, housing, community centers, and health over a long period of time. Terrible urban planning investment decisions that led to sprawl. Households with lower income being forced to settle in insecure and poorly serviced areas. and the generational proliferation of extractive economies. So first in Louisiana, it had been fruit, then it was oil, and then most recently it became tourism, which it still is. And it had created some local employment, but all the profits that were amassed were extracted and reaped far away from where that wealth was generated. And that pattern and all the decision-making that affected the lives of New Orleanians was far away from them. So things like how land was used, how work was allocated, how profits were spent, all drained from the local community and the local people who actually know the land and who actually knew where the flooding areas were and who actually knew what their own talents were and in fact knew the assets of their place. And all of that contributed to the resultant breakdown of social cohesion, and New Orleans became rife with racial violence and income equality. So that's why you had those terrible narratives after Katrina where people said, oh, just let it drown. Why should it have to recover? So then they have a disaster, but what was so interesting for me, and I was so privileged to be there, was that I got to watch in real time how a city that's unwilling to die, that people's attachment to place and their unwillingness to wait for someone else to come and rescue them, that they started to find ways to heal themselves. And they did that through focusing on their local economy. We formed this thing called the New Orleans Institute for Resilience and Innovation. This is before resilience was the current groovy word it is. It wasn't back then. And we focused on local culture and neighborhoods and art and design and all the things that were absolutely innate to New Orleans. And they've rebuilt their infrastructure to be resilient, green, participatory. They incubated a creative tech sector to keep and attract younger workers. And as I said, I've been talking about it being prophetic for 10 years. But I really think that what I'm zeroing in on is that I think that what's really prophetic is, in our time, isn't just exemplary cities like New Orleans or Detroit or other examples we know of places that have had to come back from something extraordinary. But in fact, I think the real prophecies of our time are coming from the meaning, the role of place, and how our identities and our sense of purpose and meaning is fundamentally derived from our experience of place, and how that has up until now and will continue to shape us as individuals, as cultures, and societies. Now, I wonder how many of you are familiar with this. Are there any psychology majors here? You must have taken it. You took it. So there was a guy named John Bowlby. Do you remember? No. So John Bowlby, dead psychologist, confirmed the fundamental importance of an infant forming a bond with a single human, right? Which is called attachment theory. He's the guy behind attachment theory. And that if that doesn't happen when you're an infant, then your capacity to bond and function in a healthy way and grow up is impaired and you form an attachment disorder. We've probably all got it to some degree, but some have it more profoundly than others. And that was Bowlby talking about the attachment to persons. Many years ago, I heard one of yours, Clyde Hertzman. Did anyone know Dr. Clyde Hertzman? I'm seeing some nods. Did you remember him, Sally? And he was, I think he was a clinical epidemiologist. He was a doctor and died too early, like Warren, at UBC. And I heard him lay out, I don't know if anybody else heard this, he laid out a number of conditions that support healthy childhood development. He did it spatially. And he put up a layered map showing areas in Vancouver where housing was good, where housing was not, where income was high, where income wasn't, where food was insecure, where it was secure, crime, safety. He just kept layering all this stuff up, which now we call the social determinants of health. And he basically said, if your basic needs are met from birth to 24 months, you're gonna grow up and think life's okay. Does anybody remember this? But if any of that is compromised, you're gonna grow up to believe that life sucks. And if you are a life sucks person, an adult, that's going to compromise your ability to cope, let alone flourish. And his maps that he showed at this meeting that I attended showed that we were producing way too many kids that were going to grow up to believe that life sucks. And that's probably 10 or 12 years ago that I heard him say that. Might be even longer ago. And David Holchansky's work, who delivered your lecture last year, is in many ways building on that. He's saying we've got too many of these neighborhoods that don't have basic needs, where the place is crummy, and basically that's going to compromise the capacity of that person to be able to function. So I actually live a bifurcated life, as was hinted by Gordon, or maybe Andy, I'm not sure one of you did. And one of the initiatives that I work on is this place. Do you recognize it? That's, according to the Flat Earth Society, one of the four corners of the world. That is Fogo Island. And it is led by a charitable foundation called Shorefast. It's quite a story, and I want you to go home and Google this name. You won't forget it because it's an unusual name. Zita, Z-I-T-A, Cobb, C-O-B-B. She's seventh generation. Fogo Islander, came off the island, made a lot of money, and went back and has spent it basically investing in her place. And here are a few shots of it. You may recognize this one. So they have built an extraordinary inn, but what they're doing is they're reclaiming their own way of life, their historic way of life, by strengthening their assets, what they actually have there, and building a local economy. So in the 1960s, the federal government tried to resettle coastal communities in Newfoundland that were decimated by that were being abandoned by the decimation of the fishery, the cod fishery. And it collapsed. And Fogo said its own version of, hell no, we won't go. And they created a co-op to sustain their own fishery. And then 40 years later, here they are building basically an economy based on all these local assets. Their unique topography, their innate resourcefulness. Zita is my age, that's 60. She was 12 before she saw electricity, running water, or ever saw money. How do you spell? Gordon's asking. Cobb. C-O-B-B. Zita Cobb. So their attachment is to this, is to the rock, but it's to the community. And what I'm wondering is the attachment, is John Bowles' concept of attachment theory to persons, can we even draw as clear a connection to the attachment to place? Does that form us? The Fogo Island experiment now, this year, in 2018, will have brought in $50 million of new money into the island, and it's all based on asset-based community development and a fierce commitment to their place. So if we go back to the title of my talk, The Two Solitudes, interestingly, as I suggested, the content of this novel was French-English. But when I look at this, and I realize it's the book designer, but doesn't this look interesting to you, that those are the two contrasts? And isn't that in some way, in my view, kind of pointing to this urban-rural divide? That there's a competing narrative, I think, that we've got in Canada about who are we? Where have we come, and where are we settling, and what has shaped us? And the sort of public example of this schizophrenia is this one, which is, this is from the next slide I'm going to show you is from the London Underground. And this is promoting the daily flights between Heathrow and Pearson Airport in Toronto. This is Air Transat trying to sell Brits to come to Toronto. To Toronto, where I don't think we've seen a bison, if that's what that is, in about, 700 years probably. So, and I was in Washington over the weekend. It was my birthday, as some of you know, and my beloved companion and I went to look at some art, and we went to gallery and gallery and gallery and gallery and gallery, and all what we saw repeatedly was this. This. Fabulous rural shots everywhere. Beautiful, beautiful paintings. And whenever you saw a city, which was really rare, and I think we went to 8 galleries, the one urban shot was this. We've got this mental image which says that and I think it's deep in our psyche, that cities are somehow bad. If you look at all the roots of how we do this, we always want to reclaim, rebirth, redeem, remediate, regenerate, reclaim, revitalize. We always want to bring a city back from something, the brink of evil or something. I don't know. But it's a deep-seated thing. I heard it this morning in the session that we were we were listening to. It was all about cities, and are cities really a failure? Are the answer, Now, the dilemma that we've got is that pop culture reinforces, I think, this dichotomy, this piece, that's what we all want somehow. But in fact, this is where most of us live, and where most of us are going to continue to live. And this competing narrative, I think different narratives are fine and important because pluralism counts on it, but I don't know about competing narratives. So if you look at what's really the truth in Canada, it's this. We're the most urbanized country in the world. 83%, you can see it if you look to the right there, 82. My colleague, Diane Hornwig, who was at the World Bank and who I got to know in New York and is now back in Ontario in the university system there, he's done a whole thing that in 1921, Canada was the first OECD nation to be 50% urbanized. And so in 2021, from 1921 to 2021, he wants to write a book saying halfway there. And this is the dilemma, is that this is who we are, and this is who we're continuing to become. If you look at these, you know, you can see it just steadily declines, that people in rural Canada, fewer and fewer and fewer. That's because of choice. It's also because of demographics. They're old. People are choosing to live differently, but they also aren't replicating. We don't have households the way we used to. They're the same size. And then here he was by province. And you know what's interesting, just looking at this anecdotally, you can see there's the national average. And the provinces that are more urban are generally more wealthy. And the provinces that are more rural are generally not. You can't draw complete lines here, but this is pretty startling. And interestingly, the Century Initiative, I don't know if you know about that, Google them, they're making the case that the economic future of the country is dependent on us drastically upping the number of immigrants that come to Canada, because we just don't have enough people to actually support a continued sustained economy. In the 60s, when the Canada Pension Plan was created, there were 6 working people in the 60s, those of you that remember the 60s. There were 6 working people for every retired person. When I retire, or when I should retire, there will be, for every 2 people actually working, there will be 6 retirees. So it's completely inverted. So you don't have to be a mathematician to figure this out, that it's going to be tight, right? And that doesn't even include that we're going to have more immigration, but we're also going to have all sorts of other factors that need to contribute to Canada's growing population, like climate refugees, like people fleeing the ravages of social strife. There's all sorts of things that are going to continue to push to create more and more. And we are big. We have a lot of space. So more and more people are going to come. So the question for us has to be, where are they going to live? And are they going to be life sucks people or life's okay people? Are we creating places that will work for them? So the other thing about the growth, as you know, is it's pretty much concentrated in those 3 areas. And this number is only getting bigger, that the percentage continues to be drawn to these 3 CMAs. Calgary, Edmonton starting to come up, but not anywhere near yet where these 3 are. So I think we need to think about building a shared narrative, and I think place is an answer for us. Because I don't think we can, I am tired of this constant pitting urban versus rural. My life is better than your life. Your life is more sentimental than mine, whatever it is. I'm getting tired of that, and I think we have to find a way to try to create a shared narrative based on that we all care about the quality of our place. The second thing that I want to talk about is how we make decisions, because that's one of the critical dilemmas here, and where people get most upset because they feel decisions are being made for them. You probably recognize this person. And she has this quote that's famous and broadcast all over the place, and it generally talks about cities. But in fact, I think we can argue that communities have the same dependency of any size, that people that are affected by the decisions need to be the ones that are shaping the futures. And again, I think that's a consistent instinct that people have, regardless of whether they live at West Hastings and Seymour, or if they live in a rural route somewhere. Do West Hastings and Seymour cross? Okay. Ish? Okay. There are implications to the way this works, right? If you look at the way in which populations, the way in which we see these kinds of values differences starting to cleave, even though I'm arguing that I think if you boil it down to place, you've got commonality. But if you look at the electoral maps, it's really hard. I mean, I'm sure you all saw this when I did, and you thought, wow, so who's going where, right? The coasts and the urban environments are voting in one way, and the inland hinterlands are voting in another way. And because of the way that the boundaries are created, the electoral representation is such that, as you know, in Canada, for instance, a rural riding can be in the tens of thousands. So you can be a local member there in Ottawa. You can have 80,000 constituents. If you're from a metro riding, you have hundreds of thousands of constituents. So the urban folks will argue that the urban vote is discounted, which generates this sense of everybody's, it's all about rural or it's all about urban, that people have this sense that they're not represented. This is Ontario, and again, you can see this, that's the provincial election. Actually, that's 2015, so that's actually when the Liberals won. So the Liberals had a majority government, but that's what the electoral map looked like. Like something is wrong about that, right? And this is the other one that's most telling that everybody pays attention to. Who chose Brexit? That little pocket down there, 59.9 of the people that wanted to remain, that's London. And everybody else is saying, get the heck out. So I think this is where we have to create that different narrative. And I think that if you look back to these different scales, Gordon tells me that BC would look very similar to Ontario. I think the truth of this is that our existing governance arrangements aren't working for anybody anymore. They're really not right. Canada was created in 1867, as we know, when our economy was structured around farming and natural resources, and white dudes were making the decisions. And now, 150 years later, it's clearly no longer dependent just on those things to a certain extent. There's still natural resources, much less so, and it's not the future. But our electoral representation continues to skew in these ways that don't feel quite right. And I think more importantly, what we have to come to terms with, and I don't know how they would have done this with Brexit, is that we have an old way of thinking that we thought one size could fit all when it came to public policy. We thought that we could create a national policy, for instance, and it would work for Antigonish and it would work for Red Deer. It just doesn't work that way. They don't do that. And it's true provincially, too. I worked in the provincial government very briefly, and I watched that you're trying to create a level playing field, but you know full well that a policy that you create for a downtown dense urban environment is not going to be the same policy that's going to work in rural Ontario, Northern Ontario. And where we really saw that was in electricity pricing that basically killed the Liberal government, and they could not find a way, or it was very difficult to find a way to do particularized policymaking on those issues. So we've got to try to find a way to create policies. We have a gazillion examples like this where it doesn't work and where we continue to cleave that urban-rural piece. If you think about it, gun laws, safe injection sites, land use, livestock management, energy generation, energy transmission, things that are very important to you out here, food production. This is really complicated territory, and I don't want to try to oversimplify it. And whenever you try to say, and Shauna Sylvester and I have been in these conversations, whenever you try to say, oh, maybe we should change the way that governance is arranged, maybe we need to resource governments differently, honestly, people start hearing the Constitution, it's the C word, and they just all run for the hills. But, the question would be, can we find our way? That if municipal leaders, and I don't just mean big city municipal leaders, I mean municipal human settlement leaders in Canada, had the resources and tools to solve the challenges they face directly and to seize the opportunities, if they were empowered to do that, would they? So where place meets policy and investment, I think the common denominator is that we've got to try to build a policy base that is based on place-based policy, very specific. And in governance, that's called subsidiarity. Anybody familiar with that? Any political scientists in the room? Oh, that's interesting. There's not a single political scientist here. They're all at home watching television. The idea behind subsidiarity is the government closest to the beneficiary of the policy or service should be the one to design it and implement it. And I'd go even further and say they should be the ones that pay for it. So what that would mean is that we would be able to hold accountable the politician closest to us, the decision maker closest to us, that rather than right now what happens is the city blames the province blames the feds say the city, and it just becomes this very frustrating blame game. And that's really what influenced me in my work life to become a localist. Because I really think that we have to focus on interventions on the ground that enable people to do their thing. That's what we call self-organization. And that's true in rural communities as well, where I've lived and where I continue to work. That we need to explore what Kelly Gillis, the Deputy Minister of Infrastructure Canada, is calling place-based policy. That's a very interesting thing for a federal bureaucrat to be advocating for, place-based policy. And if we were to start focusing on quality of place, and that means the suburbs too, then could we find a way for people to own their own future, own their own destiny, and be able to shape their communities? And are we willing to take the risk that means? Because then I know everybody's going to be worried that, then you're going to have rampant NIMBY, and this would be incumbent on us to be able to make sure that, in fact, local communities were accepting responsibility for the broader implications of their decisions. So if decision-making is organized to focus on the local, then the third thing that I think we have to talk about is we need to make it a top priority across the board to start investing in making great places. We actually know how to do this. We know that what makes great places. I'm sure you recognize those. One's the Eastern Market in New York, in Detroit. One is the High Line. One is an old Legion Hall in Brooklyn. And this is an office building. We know how to do this. We have great designers who know how to do this. And that it can exist in rural and in urban, and it can even exist in suburban. So if we actually know, we also know how to make shitty places. Like this, or this, right? And there's really no excuse for it anymore, I think. I don't think it's that much more money. I'm sure designers are going to be here and say, oh, yes, but really, there's no excuse. We know much better that this doesn't work. And it can be pretty simple, right? It can be just creating a place for people to congregate. So I think we need to make a commitment to find ways, and that may mean we have to incentivize good design, and we have to incentivize to make sure that good places, it's as effective and as cheap and economical to make a good place than it is to make, whoopsie, sorry, I'm going wrong, to make that, which is just a hideous place. So after we've been making great places and investing in them, then I think the next thing we have to do is focus on connective tissue, which I think is critical, in which we have failed, and New Orleans failed badly. If you think about the underpinning of community development, it's self-organization. So the top of the system is agents operating independently with a bit of interaction, and then you go to the middle, there's a little bit more interaction, and then the third part is where it's really meshing. You see this in nature all the time, that these kinds of patterns of self-organization are how ecosystems thrive. We actually know how to do this, and urban environments do it, but so do rural. So how we build transit, how we create streets and thoroughfares. I know there's an urban geographer in the room. She's the person who's going to be talking about this all the time to her students, that it's dependent on connective tissue. If you look at this is in Medellin, Colombia. I don't know if any of you know about this. This is Comuna 13. This is a part, the way that Medellin works in Colombia is that the commerce is all down in the valley, and then there are all these low-income neighborhoods that surround it up in the mountains, and what they were finding is that the communities up there, the kids weren't going to school, nobody could get to work, the roads were terrible. So the planners went up and actually talked to the community, imagine that, and said, what do you need? And they said, we need some way to get down. How can we get down? And they built these escalators, which I was on, and which are extraordinary. The one weird thing is that when you're on those escalators, they have music piped in. And the time I was on it, they were playing Frank Sinatra's My Way, which seemed a bit odd. But what's interesting is that what it did is it's created this. So they had there are banks and banks of these, and you get up to the top, and then what happened was all of a sudden people were coming up there, and so the local folks went to the city and said, well, we want to make our houses look better. So the city said, well, we'll buy the paint. You try to choose the colors and paint. So they did this. So this kind of connective tissue, it's a really vivid example of how that's transformed those communities so that now people can actually get from place to place. And there are metaphorical versions of connective tissue, and then there are actual visceral ones like this, or tangible ones like this. In Fogo Island, Zita uses this, the cauliflower. She's basically saying every community is a floret, and they are dependent on the stem. And that when there's disruption to the stem, the floret will suffer. And so that's the notion of connective tissue that she's trying to use for her remote area that has an economy that has to be part of a global economy, but that she wants to have linked in some way. A few years ago, I was involved in an initiative in New York called Reimagining the Civic Commons. And this was all about connective tissue in urban environments. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the commons notion, but it's a rural concept right there. And this is Port Meadow in Oxford. I don't know how many people would recognize that, but this is how we used to do it. Communities had a shared meadow. And then we started to move away from that kind of collective notion and started to use other phrases like the famous one, the tragedy of the commons, that somehow we couldn't be trusted to actually marshal our resource and husband it responsibly. So we started to look at that in American cities and recognize that we had elements of the civic commons, but that they weren't connected. But we also found that because of patterns of urban development and consumer spending, that people were basically creating this. So they were getting everything, they were doing all their shopping at Amazon. They didn't go to the Y anymore. They went to private health clubs. They didn't play in a public golf course. They had a private one, and they started gaining their communities. And we said, well, how are we going to break that down? So we started talking about, could you reimagine a civic commons that took people, talent, opportunity, technology, spaces and places, and connected them in a new kind of way? Because part of what the civic commons does is give you a chance to interact with someone who's not like you. In the old days, when I was a kid, my father would take us to the library, and he would go and get classical records, and my sister and I would look in the children's area. And you, in that library, would have a chance to see people and interact with people that weren't like you. They weren't your neighbors. And I know any of you that have gone into libraries now, certainly in this city, the library is an extraordinary place that continues to attract a diverse population and diverse user group. And in Ontario, they're cutting libraries. So there is something fundamentally wrong with that picture. We have to instill and continue to invest in and connect in the civic commons, because the civic commons allows us to do together what we can't do alone. This is part of what settlement patterns are, and that we form up and do these things. And then there are the sort of contemporary versions of this. And the other thing about the civic commons that we learned is that you don't want to be too rigid about who owns the civic commons even, as long as it's got a community use. People are distrusting of private spaces, but in fact, it may be that in certain markets, private spaces are the ones that can be democratized more quickly than the public space. We forget that. We forget that in other cultures, in fact, a private space may be able to be made more commonly used than the public one. So, in New Orleans, back to when I was there, I drew this very humble sketch because this is what I watched happen in New Orleans. In neighborhoods, hubs started to form up. Places, people would open their homes, they would adopt a church, they would find a place where they could find people like them who were their neighbors, who had a common interest, and they would form a support group. And then over time, they recognized they needed to actually reach out to others who had something that they didn't have, and that they would then build this sort of matrix. And so I basically watched this kind of formation reseed itself in New Orleans after Katrina. But in fact, I look at this diagram now and I think, in many ways I was channeling it's a fractal image. It works at another scale. But that may work in a city, but I think it works in a region, and I think it works in a province and a nation as well. That we need this kind of interdependent relationship. That if you took one of those centers and said that's a metropolitan urban area, and then you have relationships with the hinterlands, which is traditionally how urban and rural have interacted, that trade went both ways, that commerce went both ways, natural resources went both ways. And this is just a reality of how we function. How do we actually start to mimic this? 20 years ago, when the internet was being created, many of us thought that's the answer. Do you remember? Does anybody remember that? How hopeful we were? We thought that was the answer. We thought, this is sort of what the internet looks like. This is actually 4 square check-ins. But if you get a picture of the internet, it looks like this, except a lot bigger and a lot more crowded and a lot denser. And we thought, that's the answer. We're going to have all this connective tissue, and it's going to allow us to be interacting with people who aren't like us all the time. But the dilemma that we face now, of course, is that this has now gotten so segmented that we're really only connecting with people that agree with us and that are like us. And it's not actually, in fact, it's insulating us from the other. And I wonder about that, in the past you'd meet them in church, you might meet them on the street, lots of people don't get out of their cars, et cetera, and the internet's not the solution for that. So it leaves me with this question, how can we get better at building civic empathy? Which is, I think, basically what I'm suggesting in this talk, is it's about civic empathy. So, it's a crazy, complex, complicated world. I really hate to think that I'm giving you any kind of definitive anything, but what I am going to do is, and we're just one little piece of it, we're Canada, and there's BC, and there's Vancouver, and then there's this neighbor. We're just a small part. But I think the risks of us not finding a way to bridge are pretty serious. And we see it in populism everywhere, and we see it in Brexit, and we see it all the time. You see it in your electoral life, and you also see it in your economic life. Because the reality is that proximity and density in urban life has serious consequences. It means that innovation and economic development is dependent on that, and so that's where the wealth is. The more successful a city gets, the more unequal it becomes. And similarly, the more intense and dense a city becomes, the more the values become more and more progressive, because we recognize, first of all, newcomers are attracted to cities, and we recognize that we live in interdependence, so we need transit and we need schools that support pluralism, and we require tolerance to live in those environments. But cities at the same time need their hinterlands. They need them economically for resources and manufacturing and leisure pursuits. But rural communities are also enormously interdependent. They're on each other and on the cities where the larger markets are. So we're in a conundrum where we're dependent on one another. So I'm going to wrap up by saying, here are my prescriptions, such as they are, and then I want a big conversation about which of them you think is ludicrous or what else should we be thinking about. First one, we need to build a shared narrative focused on the importance of our local places in our largest cities, the smaller ones, our suburbs, and our rural communities. A bold narrative that is about both and that refutes that Canada is a zero-sum country. And let's build our civic empathy. I think we need to abolish stereotypes, and we have lots of those. And that means we have to start finding a way to have a much better understanding and not to assume. I remember when I was living rural, and my friend Caroline was with me in the country, and I was a gay woman living in a very rural environment, in an old school, and I was very worried. This was in 1990, and I thought, what are they going to think about a lesbian trotting into that place? And after a year and a half, I had the nerve to ask my neighbor, who was driving a truck part-time and farming the other part, and I said to him, Ron, is it an issue that I'm gay? He turned to me and he said, Mary, really what people care about here is whether you're willing to ride the hay wagon in August. He said, and I don't think that's a problem for you, is it? And I said, no. So I also remember at the same time when I was living in Grey County, they had a local community symphony. And I was very disdainful of that. I thought, well, why would I ever go to a community symphony when I could go to Roy Thompson Hall and hear the Toronto Symphony? And then, I know these are just facile anecdotes, but I'm just telling you how I had to own this myself, my own bias. And so I went once. They were playing Dvorak's New World Symphony, and I was so moved by what I heard and watched. I watched people all amateur, who had worked on that piece, and they nailed that sucker. It sounded fabulous, but I also was aware that it elevated us. It didn't really matter that we were in a high school gym. And I thought to myself, my God, culture is everywhere. And how do I release myself of this urban snobbery that I have carried into that environment? So if we think about places like this, we've got to strengthen our uniqueness of place so that we don't, no more RioCans. Anybody here who works for RioCans, sorry. We just can't do this. We've got to expect better. And that means we've got to look at heritage conservation, investment in public spaces, elements of the Civic Commons, everywhere. And we can never get enough beauty in our lives. That's a perfect line to tweet if someone wants to tweet that. We can never get enough beauty. So let's empower our architects and our designers and artists to make our places more beautiful. Let's just demand that. This is a wonderful quote that Zita Cobb uses in her presentations from Gill Lee Chin, who I think was an urban planner. I don't know if anybody recognizes his name. His view is that humanistic globalization requires us to create a global network of intensely local places. So to do that, let's do this. Let's reject one-size-fits-all policies, forget it, and insist on place-based or even better, place-led governance. That means more power to mayors, more power to wardens, more power to councils, and more taxing authority. This is when my talk gets really popular. And then we have to make sure that we fully engage people to not think about NIMBY, but to go towards YIMBY. Let's strengthen local economies by, and you guys are great at this, buying local, creating community land trusts like you've just done up in Burnaby, finding new pools of capital to invest in small businesses and assist with succession. 80% of the GDP in Canada comes from small businesses, and 60% of those folks want to turn their business over in a decade, and they have no one to turn it over to. So if the per capita income in rural Canada and small places continues to so significantly lag larger cities, if people still feel they're being taken advantage of or shortchanged, the reactionary populism that we're dealing with is just going to get worse. So when you're shopping, you need to think about where is your money going. Let's find incentives. What about our pension funds to build back our civic commons? That means converting churches, legion halls, curling clubs, community centers, post offices, banks into shared working spaces, community hubs, maker spaces, community kitchens, and of course, libraries. This is the library in Medellin, and what I love about this, well, it's not the only library, this is a very small library. It looks like a Hudson bookseller when you're in it, but you know where it is? It's in a station to get this. They also, in addition to those escalators, they built these funiculars that take you, again, from the bottom to the top, and you can get a book while you're waiting for the gondola. It's fantastic. So let's make, this is a tough one, and I think we have to get serious about let's make universal broadband absolutely the top priority for every part of Canada. We have a national goal to have 100% coverage by 2030. That is a lifetime away. We need to move that up. It has to be by 2021, 2022. I think we should prioritize all forms of connective tissue. That means regional express rail, 5G. I'd like to see university extension programs come back. Can't we bring university extension programs back? I was raised with that. And why don't we do this with rural schools? Why do we insist on kids taking long bus rides? It's ridiculous. Why aren't we letting local school boards make those decisions and First Nations figure that out, what resources they need and how we can co-invest with them? Another example of this, I'm trying to find tangible ways that we can do things. We need to support local and regional media startups. So that means you look at your budget and you figure out how many subscriptions can you afford. And then you start signing up for those local things. And don't just assume that someone else will do that. Let's all do that so that we share local information and commentary. And then let's try to find ways, and I'm interested in the discussion, let's talk about how we can do this. Let's find ways to read and listen to folks who do not agree with us. How many read Conrad Black's full-page article today in the National Post? One person. Two people. We have to find a way to do this. We have to find a way to put ourselves in that situation where we are reading people that don't necessarily agree with us. And why don't we insist Facebook change its algorithm so that they don't just feed me stuff that I've liked? Some of you have probably figured out how to game that. I don't know how to do it yet, but we need to do that. I think we can do this at really, really community-based levels. Like, why don't we bring back exchange programs? Why don't downtowners say, let's go to the suburbs and share a meal? Why don't they attend a town council meeting? Why don't we get some pen pals going? Shauna, why don't you get pen pals going again? Listening circles, study groups, anything that gives us some kind of common connection. Here's an area where you have really led and where you need to continue to advocate. We should be kickstarting and absolutely resourcing a modular housing industry in Canada, because you're leading the way on this, because we need affordable and probably smaller and more sustainable housing. There's really no place in Canada that does not need a better mix of housing. And it's really a fundamental block of the life sucks, life's okay condition. Let's double down on immigration, Google the Century Initiative. If you need inspiration, read Chop Suey Nation. It's a wonderful book about Chinese restaurants in small towns across Canada, including Fogo Island. Or listen to This American Life podcast, where they talk about a library that's on the U.S.-Canada border. Has anybody heard it? Isn't it fabulous? And how it's basically Syrian refugees that are populating that on both sides of the border. Let's demand more from our elected leaders. No more pitting us against each other. Let's just not tolerate that. Let's say that we challenge them, that they need to find common ground, and that they should be supporting placemakers, people like us, to find local solutions. So I'll just close by refuting my main theory, which is that I'm increasingly less convinced that this divide is about topography, or geography, rather. It's about topography, but it's not about geography. I actually think it's about the divide between people for whom the system has worked and for whom the system has not worked. I think it's basically about fairness. I was recently at a workshop, rural, attended by lots of urban folks, and there was a person there youngish, and probably the only billionaire in the room, who talked about how most people have been lining up in their life, working, raising a family, doing what they need to do, and they're in line, and they think there's something at the end. They're working towards something, some kind of paradise at the end. And they hope that they're going to realize whatever aspirations at the end of the line. And what they've found is that over time, more and more people just keep cutting in line in front of them. And those people are in downtown grocery stores, they're in suburban malls, they're in quick marts all over the country. The system isn't working. Their kids are living in the basement. They've got all sorts of challenges. They can't find a job. Now, we may never be able to fully like or fully trust each other across these differences. But I think we can respect each other, and I think we can agree and bond together to build for ourselves and each other a network of many, many better, intensely local places, what Gill Lee-Chin suggested. Now, I know there are others, and some of you in this room, who are going to advocate for top-down legislative changes, universal basic income, redistribution of wealth, all sorts of things. And that's great that you're engaged in that. But I know, and I can tell you from my own experience, that no top-down policy leadership will work unless it's met with a groundswell of support and resonance. And better if it starts on the ground, in fact, and it moves on up. Because if we don't do that, we're just going to continue to see this. So the interesting thing about place is that I actually think we know how to do this. I think that's yours and my task leaving tonight, is to look for ways to provide place-based leadership, a new narrative, and bridge our divides from the ground up, one place at a time. This is the urban forest in Bandung, Indonesia. Indonesia, 80% of the population is younger than 40. They didn't have any kind of relationship to the natural environment, so kids got in there and they made these great events in the forest. This is Lower Manhattan, the night of Hurricane Sandy. No power, south of 34th Street. That's that place. One of the most powerful places in the US, leveled by a storm. This is another slide of Fogo on a beautiful, cool night. It's about place. And then this is my last slide, which is about place. This is 1970, London, Ontario, Maitland Street. That's me, playing hockey with my girls' skates on, my Marie Jelnick skates, in a backyard rink 2 doors over. That's the Haymans, Sally. That's the Haymans backyard rink. That's where my sense of place began, and my sense of interdependence, and my sense of community. And what an elegant, simple thing to do, to build a rink in your backyard that allowed me to start to have a sense of how we actually create better environments for us to flourish. Thank you very much.